I'm going to read a little bit from that Mike Spry article that's been causing a lot of controversy on the CanLit scene, the CanLit scene, and then I'm going to add some comments of my own, and also try to contextualize this article within other kinds of experience, other kinds of problems that exist at creative writing programs in Canada, and also place it within the context of some Twitter commentary, and place it within the context of other forms of politics. Nobody does peak woke politics quite like the Canadian literati. It seems to be that if an issue isn't genderized or isn't racialized, that it's somehow not political. But there are other forms of politics too. Now, first of all, the Spry piece is worth reading, and I do recommend it quite strongly because although it has a somewhat sketchy quality at the beginning, it begins with references to an article, a now notorious article by Jason Guriel on how you shouldn't read widely but should read obsessively, which is pretty much disconnected from what follows. But then when Spry does work up sort of ahead of steam, he has several interesting points to make. And he describes his own disenchantment and his own misgivings about what happened when he was trying to make it as a writer. And what he does is he describes how he sort of made it within the ecosystem of his particular creative writing department and his particular small literary scene. He writes, pretty soon I was suffering from small pond syndrome myself and reveling in my own mediocrity. I thought I was moving up. When my first book was shortlisted for a prize, I was elated. This was a moment for me beyond the celebration of a good workshop or open mic night applause. My dad bought me a jacket. I bought nice shoes which I would wear to step into the next level of community I aspired to. The two other writers on the list were well regarded through the false lens of CanLit. At the ceremony, I went up to introduce myself, nervous and proud in my new suit. One of the writers ignored me. The eventual winner shook my hand and said, quote, "You know, I had never even heard of your book until the list came out," unquote. When he took to the stage to accept his award, he was quick to congratulate the other nominee, then listed several books that should have been nominated instead of mine. I was crushed. Within the dynamic of CanLit, the established own the aspiring. My books were lazily edited by men more interested in my ability to stay up late and drink on Tuesdays than my writing. Their lack of commitment to the work kept me below them on the CanLit food chain. My books had been published by small presses not only as my reward for serfdom, but to feed the entitlement of the editors and to supply the raw grist for their grant-funded small press vanity projects. I had propped up the hierarchy and was duly rewarded, but that hierarchy was still rigid, and I was far from being an equal. End quote. Now, one comment here, and one point that I think really is being overlooked so far in this discussion, is the way basically small presses in Canada work. I mean, small presses everywhere are pretty much the same. They operate on a shoestring. Nobody who publishes with them is bound to get wealthy. But what distinguishes the Canadian scene from other scenes is the degree of government support. Publishers like to describe themselves as having private companies, and that's one reason that they use, for example, not to reveal their sales figures. But in reality, as people know, the government block grants are absolutely crucial to the survival of these small presses, and in fact, editors, owners of small presses and editors who live in big cities like Toronto or Vancouver and who end up at presses where there's enough of a sort of seniority system enough seniority that's been established to allow the press to keep getting block grants on a regular basis, use their positions as forms of sinecures, and They end up with a regular income, which the writers don't have, can't count on, and put down mortgages on houses, and as a result become rich. Whereas the writers, who tend to have much more unstable incomes or no income at all, really, from their book sales, and recall that these small presses tend to do a very bad job at promoting books. Resultingly, the writers live in a state of precarity, don't buy houses, and don't, as property values go up, become rich. So there's a class element to what happens in terms of relations between small press owners and their writers. In effect, it's a bit like a small factory in which you have the owners getting rich and the laborers working pretty much at starvation wages. I wish that was a point that Spry had sort of dwelled on a little bit more, because I think it's a very key one. And this discussion has been framed very much within terms of gender. On Twitter, for example, some of the comments have been just filled with rage at sort of the gender aspect of it, and claiming that even men who've been sharing the Mike Spry article aren't doing enough, and they have to change in this very sort of self-flagellating kind of way. Well, there are big problems. As Spry comments throughout the article, there are big problems within the department that he was at Concordia, with professors, male professors hitting on female students and so forth. And yeah, obviously this is a very important issue, and I don't want to somehow diminish the importance of that discussion, but I do want to underline the degree to which, in Canadian literature, there is a tendency to effectively treat politics, the word politics, as something that exists almost entirely within the parameters of gender or race. And that's a starting point. This is my complaint. That's a starting point, but it's not enough. There are other issues too, for example, issues of class, the ones that I just described. And there are issues too of world politics. And again, this is an area where Canadian literature really, really must do better, and doesn't do better. And the problem here, because I write about world politics and so forth, is that it does not even compute with the people running small presses, big presses, or agencies in Canada. This is the small pond syndrome that Spry describes is a bit of a small mind syndrome too, unfortunately. And so if you're going to write about something, for example, the history of the Koreas, it's been in the news, good luck getting it published if you're dealing with that from a literary perspective and want to talk about the geopolitics of Asia. This is of extreme significance to the world, and it's not being handled well either by nonfiction publishing, although they're doing a better job. Literary publishing in Canada is not only not so successful financially. Not many books get sold. Canadian literature is not popular with general readers. Even general readers in Canada who like reading a lot tend to sort of shy away from buying Canadian books. One reason is because of accessibility. They tend not to be distributed as well as they could within bookstores. But another reason is because of the choices the publishers make. For example, there are no Canadian political thrillers as a genre. There's very little Canadian science fiction. Why not? There are not enough graphic novels. There's not enough experimentation with form. There's not enough illustration in books. People buy books because they like the look of them, because they have pictures in them. These are things that publishing cultures in other countries understand, and that Canadians in publishing tend to be very fusty and very, very sort of hidebound about. And it doesn't do us any good. So you end up with books that are about very narrow themes, that are about peak woke politics, but not about geopolitics. Books that are overpriced, books that are uninteresting sort of as commodities. They don't have enough art in them. They don't have good covers. They have mediocre design. They are thematically rather limited and rather fey quite often, quite bourgeois in the worst sense of the word. And to top it off, you have this unhealthy culture with a sort of power tripping that Spry is describing, partly in terms of harassment and sexual abuse, but also in terms of just general power tripping. At one point in the Spry article, he talks about being insulted by a female professor at Concordia, where he was, and he passes over that very quickly. But in reality, there are abusive people working within Canadian literature who are female, quite a few of them actually, and that needs to be discussed too. It's not really sexual abuse, but it's emotional abuse and it's power tripping and so forth. So there's a lot that could be talked about right now, but beyond the peak woke elements of sort of the nefariousness of a certain type of man, these other issues are not getting talked about, and I hope these other discussions do happen, but I'm not going to hold my breath.